We're back. Season 6, Episode 1, The Crystalling, Part 1. This is the episode in which Flurry Heart isn't named yet. We find out that, I can't think of it, Shining Armor and they've had a baby. I can't think of her name. Oh my god. Cadence, that's it. Cadence and Shining Heart have had a baby. The baby is born. We already knew it was coming. And they're trying to deal with that, but at the same time, Starlight's trying to reconnect with her old friend Sunburst, and it's just not going well, and it's kind of bad, but I'm sure it'll be fine, and then the entire world is destroyed forever. Questions? So, is someone here? Are we live? We might be live. So there's this vast, unlabeled castle. So, on the one hand, I'm like, wow, like, you get used to it after all, right? Like, you know what that's like. And that's true, I'm sure most of you guys would actually know about this, even from a video game perspective. You just kind of get to know the layout of Dark Souls, or World of Warcraft, or Zelda after a while. You know where things are, because you've gone around them enough to know the pattern, right? It's true in real life, too. You know, when you're out driving, you know where you're going because you've been there before and you know the layout, or you at least are experienced enough to know how to get back to the layout. At the same time, though, you'd think they could label something, like just chisel some signs or some symbols into the walls. Something, anything. And I was about to go on this whole rant about proper labeling, but then I realized that most of my stuff isn't labeled. Like, I've got a tote, and a tote, and a tote, and a tote. Now, I know what those totes are. That one's the NES stuff, that one's the current stuff, that one's the PlayStation stuff, and that one's the SNES stuff. Now, I know that without even having to glance at those, because that's what they are. Each tote is actually slightly visually distinct from each other, but there's no labels. Someone else would just look at that like, And most of my stuff, like, paperwork-wise, is labeled in ways that would probably make no sense to anybody else whatsoever. I tend to use numbers a lot, for example. So on the other hand, I guess I understand why the castle isn't exactly super well labeled. Now, unfortunately, S.A. Ross isn't here, so he can't, complain about how much I'm going to gush about Starlight in this episode. But allow me to gush about Starlight in this episode. Now, the actress does help a lot. She is a wonderful actress and absolutely sells the character in many different ways. But you'll notice how Starlight is immediately and massively forgiven. I can't really bring up why that doesn't bother me yet, because it hasn't really come up yet. But all I'm going to say is that they do something with that in the future, so I'm with it. Moving on. Meanwhile, Twilight has way too many lists for friendship lessons, which again I'd like to make fun of, except as I'm saying this, I can see my iTunes in the background, which has literally hundreds of different playlists, which are meticulously sorted by tone and style and category. Moving on. What? Oh. Already filed my taxes, Amazon. Thank you. God. Have you filed your taxes? Yes. So Starlight is in noticeably over her head, not knowing what to do or how to do it outside of her particular element. Emphasis on the outside of her element thing. Anytime she's in her comfort zone, she's fine. I imagine that's the kind of thing that most of us could relate to some extent or another, since most of us have our comfort zones. And as a consequence of having those comfort zones... Oh, there's S.A. Ross. Hey, I'm going to gush about Starlight today. As a result of having those comfort zones, that's where we're cool. That's where we know what we're doing and how we're doing it. Hello, Raid. This again goes back to what Lord Harrimont was saying. The fact that, this is the season of Outcasts. In fact, I've already kind of set up the thumbnail that'll be going for the Season 6 stuff as a direct consequence of the fact that Twister has just donated for Dungeons 3, which I will jot down very quickly so I don't lose my train of thought. Now, this then leads to Spike, who, thank you, by the way, Twister, very, very much. Spike is... This episode's a weird one. You know how we've not quite jokingly mentioned how Spike and Twilight seem to share a brain, and it just kind of passes, back and forth a little bit as they go. So Spike starts off not really having a brain, but then kind of having a brain. He shows off how I was this big hero, right? Isn't that great? He's actually here to talk about the information that they've already gathered about what a crystalling is, so we can get some exposition about that. What's interesting here, though, is there's a very brief panning shot, which I actually rewound to watch a second time, because all of the characters' expressions and reactions to him being like, I'm a big hero, were actually kind of interesting to me. Rainbow was just whatever. Applejack is completely unimpressed. Rarity is trying really hard not to laugh because of how adorable it is. Fluttershy just looks kind of shy and embarrassed, and Pinkie Pie is super disbelieving. But my favorite reaction is Starlight's, whose reaction is, huh? Spike's a big hero? Now, not only is that surprisingly decent and utterly irrelevant foreshadowing, but it also lines up neatly with how she doesn't really fit in with the rest of the main five. I'll get to that later. So Spike gets some exposition, and this then leads to a bit where Twilight has decided one of the possible friendship lessons that can happen is that Starlight can reconnect with Sunburst. Can I just say, as someone who has had panic attacks as recently as last week, Starlight's descent into panic is actually really well presented. It's not quite as well presented as some of the other stuff they've shown in this show, but generally speaking, and this is one of the things that impresses me about this show, when they portray an emotional trauma like that, like freaking out or panicking or whatever, it's good. They do a good job of showcasing it, and the visual and audio presentation, as you hear just the pitch kind of whining louder and louder in the background, and the rest of the audio just kind of dims and fades. Yeah, that's pretty legit. Very well done. Excellent credit on that one. So as I mentioned, Spike mostly has a brain in this episode. He does pass it back and forth a little bit, but you'll notice how whereas Twilight is, ignorant, or not ignorant is the wrong word. Whereas Twilight doesn't pick up on anything, let's put it that way. Twilight's wisdom score is pathetic. Oblivious, there we go, it's a perfect word for that. Spike, he picks up on it immediately. Starlight, what's wrong? And picks up on the signs and, tries to talk through with her. This also leads to actually a surprisingly nice little bit of exposition. This episode does some surprisingly good exposition overall. Credit to Mr. Haber. You'll also notice in the flashbacks, a very clear pattern is visually presented. Sunburst had the knowledge, Starlight had the power. Now, we've seen this dynamic a lot. I'll go ahead and admit I am biased because I like this dynamic. This is the kind of dynamic that makes perfect sense to me and is very valid because it is very valid in real life. This is a very common thing in real life. That actor on that camera cannot do their job properly without the support staff, right? We talked about this extensively during the FF14 run of Shadowbringers. A Star Destroyer is a Star Destroyer, but it's nowhere near as effective or capable of operating without that support infrastructure, without the knowledge and the hairdo, and etc., etc., etc. So, Sunburst being portrayed as the person who knows magic, whereas Starlight being portrayed as the person who can do magic, I'm kind of with that. See, I would completely disagree with that, Lord Harrowmont. I'm curious why you would even say that. Since, just to use an immediate example right off the top of my head, she tries to lift a block, she barely succeeds, he shows her the proper spell, and then she does it beautifully. Or how about when she's trying to clean the kitchen, and once shown the proper magic by him, she then cleans the whole kitchen within, seconds. Yeah, exactly. Sunburst wiped the jute, Starlight cleaned the house. So I'm not sure where you're getting that from, exactly. Exactly, Sierra Mike. They do a really good visual presentation of the teamwork on display, which could have been awesome. Yeah, I've noticed that too. Imperial Star Destroyer, but, we actually see this a lot in modern movies as well as modern video games. It's usually referred to as the guy in the chair, or the person in the chair, who is, the support staff, right? The person who's like, hey, what's up? The books that almost crushed her was when his power manifested, when he got his cutie mark, so I don't think that particularly qualifies personally. Yeah, Ned from Spider-Man is a good example of that. Anyways, we can just disagree on this, Lord Harrowmont, because I don't have anything else to add. Either way, the point is that it's shown that there was good teamwork between the two. He knew magic, she did magic. We also see a few tidbits of one of her first character trait, which is that she's good at remixing other people's spells. She couldn't do that spell on her own. That's the kind of thing Twilight would do, inventing a new spell. But once shown the spell, she could use it to better effect, remixing the spell. This will be a recurring trait in the future, and as I've already pointed out, this is something that's already started to be a thing as of now. We have the slow descent, we have the duo, we have the person in the chair. Spike then comes in and starts expositing a little bit. There's this nice little tidbit. Starlight says a line, which I wrote down here. He's some big important wizard, and I can't even find my way around this castle. That says a lot, and it says so much I actually hesitate to sit and unpack that one line of dialogue. But the point is that obviously there's some expectation. She believes that he's gone on to do much bigger and better things without her, because obviously she wasn't important to him, right? There's also the fact that she is feeling embarrassed about her inability to deal with normal, everyday things, which is, again, the whole out-of-element thing, outcast, yada, yada, yada. But Spike, continuing to have a brain, not only exposits very quickly the fact that, you know, there's this whole, you did all these horrible things earlier, but also mentions one of the key points of a good friendship, or even a friendship you're attempting to build for the first time, is shared interests, which is duh, as they say. I'm pretty sure many people would agree with you on that, Weods. Shared interests. You both like magic, you both know magic pretty well. It's entirely possible he would be interested in what you've done with your magic, so why don't you tell him? This is, of course, appropriate foreshadowing in its own right, because she will not tell him anything that she did for a bit, because she is embarrassed about that, but we'll get to that in a minute. Meanwhile, I want to go ahead and admit something here. I tend to like the trope of someone who's super powerful, who doesn't know everyday things. This isn't a very common trope. Maybe that's one of the reasons I enjoy it so much, because it's one of those rare treats for me. Probably one of my favorite examples of this off the top of my head is actually from a webcomic called Questionable Content. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of that. I'm rather fond of it. In fact, I've got several of his books right there. Signed copies, too. In fact, hang on. This is actually... Hang on. Okay, so I actually have... I'm sorry, I want to show off really quick. I've actually got a quick sketch he did on the fly, because I met him at Gen Con of Hannelore there. Because Hannelore was my favorite character at the time. This is several years ago, obviously. Anyways, good webcomic. Highly recommend it. I will freely admit that I have taken some story ideas from Questionable Content, which I'd like to express in the future. But the relevant point here is there's a character called... I forget what she called herself. It called itself. They? I guess they is more accurate, because they're plural. But they called themselves SpookyBot for a little bit there. SpookyBot, just for those of you not aware, is an extremely powerful something, which hasn't even been fully expounded on, who has no idea how to do things like make friends or have an everyday interaction with a normal person. And again, I like that. Like, that's the kind of trope that I enjoy, more than I probably should. I would also mention that Star Trek did this once that I'm aware of, where Q, this is a TNG episode, Q was made human. Now that was a little bit different, but still, Q had no idea how to operate in a normal society or function, because he was just completely unfamiliar with all of that. It's also worth noting that the double act of Q and Data was freaking fantastic in that episode, which helped sell it, but you get my point. So I'm kind of with the idea of Starlight being this ridiculously powerful mage who has no idea how to do any of this crap. So I like that. And yeah, Tyrael in Diablo 3 is actually another good example of what I'm talking about. The great and powerful former Archangel of Justice, who doesn't know how to eat. Eat properly, I should say. He knows how to put food in his mouth and chew, but he doesn't know how to... Anyways. So I like that kind of thing. So I wanted to admit that because it's the second of like 5 reasons why I like Starlight so much. And I'm going to try to be explaining, because that's what I tend to do. I don't know if you guys have seen me before. I try to explain why I like something, not just say, that's awesome. Yes, I would actually, S.A. Ross, because she is quite magically powerful, but she also has a lot of book knowledge. Interestingly enough, I'm not sure if that was deliberate or not, but in hindsight, it would be probably more likely that Sunburst is one extreme of Twilight, whereas Starlight is the other, but... So they get to... I absolutely think Moondancer and Sunburst will get along. They get to the train ride. This is a minor point, but I wanted to address it anyways. Applejack has made a traditional family baby rocker out of the apple trees from the farm. And that's really sweet. That is touching. It also says a lot about how far they've come in the last 4 years. As I pointed out back in the day, I don't think they were friends in Season 1, and I think they were still becoming friends through Season 2. It was only by Season 3 that they actually were friends. I think we've officially gotten to the point now where they could consider themselves family. And there's just something heartwarming about that. And again, it does show how far we've come since the early episodes. Progress, continuity, it's cool, I'm with it. Rainbow gives the mobile, Rainbow gives the mobile, Rarity gives the blanket, and once again we see that teamwork theme is being kind of possibly even unintentionally woven into the narrative. The fact that all of them combined can make a better gift than one of them can by themselves. Now, I suppose you could just say that's a common theme for the episode or the series in general, but whatever. Well, it's a party, S.A. Ross. This then leads to an exposition moment, which is immediately blanketed over by Starlight's unease, which is actually, again, a surprisingly good exposition moment in this episode. It helps the exposition transition a little bit. Twilight is once again missing all of the cues, and Spike is once again trying to encourage her, like, hey, maybe you should just tell, just tell her. Come on, let's go. She's right there. This then leads to something I'm going to share. This is a little personal, so please forgive me. We see Shining Armor. He is tired and jazzed. I'm not sure if I would think the same way about this if I hadn't already been through what he has gone through. I've taken care of a newborn and a young child before, full time. And it is, the way he talks about it's amazing and wonderful and amazing and confusing and surprising and amazing. That's actually pretty accurate. I've said before that taking care of my niece full-time, 100%, 24 hours 7, was one of the most stressful and tiring and difficult and awesome times of my life, even though that I was actually going through some horrible stuff at that point in my life. All I really remember is taking care of her. It is incredibly tiring. It just drags you down. And it got to the point where I would get in minutes of sleep, literally. Oftentimes, while she was playing on something that I knew was safe, while my ears were in alert mode. And some of you know what that means, when your ears are in alert mode and you hear anything off, like silence or a loud noise or whatever, and you're up immediately. What's wrong? Right? So you get those minutes of sleep. I know exactly what that feels like, and I mention this because this is not the first time they've shown something like this with regards to parenthood in this show. And it makes me feel if someone who was involved in writing this, either Mr. Haber himself or someone else who helped and assist in the breaking of this episode, has actually been a parent, to be able to personally relate exactly what that feels like. Very, very accurate. I like that too, by the way, S.A. Ross. That is a nice touch. Again, Spike's actually pretty good in this episode, but this leads me to Spike being awesome in this episode. He pushes for the friendship lesson to happen anyways. Once again, he has the brain there, but he's trying to encourage her, and he has successfully read the situation such that she needs to be pushed out of her comfort zone on this one. Now, I point that out because sometimes we shouldn't be pushed out of our comfort zone. Despite what fiction often portrays, not everyone should be an extrovert, and not everyone should rush out there and try new things all the time. That is not true, and it's something that actually irritates me when fiction tries to push that narrative. However, sometimes we do need a moment where we need to be pushed out of that comfort zone. Reading that moment is the difficult part. And that's why I give credit to Spike here, because he has successfully read that Starlight does need to be pushed on this one. And he pushes. He comes up with the idea, he says, I got her. And talks about it to her immediately after, tries to console her, tries to comfort her. It's okay, trust the lesson. Trust the lesson, it's okay, we got this. This then leads to Starlight's second character trait. She's villainous. This is the other reason I like her, believe it or not. Now, this is something I've been wanting to talk about for like a couple of years at this point, because ever since we started, ever since I started jotting down mental notes for this show. One of the other things, I mentioned there's like 5 things I like about Starlight. One of those things is the fact that she is villainous. Not evil, by the way. But the way she approaches things is from a villain's perspective. She's the kind of person who will, her approach, her style, is far more of, I'm going to do things in, I don't know how to put it, she's villainous. She's villainous in how she operates, but not in her intent. This is going to come up much more later. This is just the tiniest little brief insight into that personality trait. But when she realizes there is a path possible forwards where she can go ahead and say, oh, you know, maybe we should hear about this. And she even does it really smoothly. Like, wait a minute, why is there a statue of you? Like, she has a valid point. She's not making this up. She's like, there's a statue right there. You gotta tell me about this. She does evil for good. I mean, kinda, yeah. And so she just kind of slides that in there, has the popcorn ready to go, and is like, okay, whew, mission accomplished. And you see why I call this villainous but not evil. It's a very, very rare character trait, once again, and it's one I almost never see in fiction. I have seen it a few times, but it is really rare that I see that kind of approach. Funnily enough, people could and would argue that Discord on this very show is also villainous without being evil. Anyways, so, nice little tidbit is the fact that Spike is just kind of whatever about this whole thing. I mean, he's certainly proud of this, but he's not trying to boast. There we go. He's not trying to boast about this. I keep getting an L stuck in there. I'm like, boast isn't a word. Well, yeah, his goal is Starlight, but I bring this up because I think this is actually decent continuity, believe it or not, because if you remember, we've already had a Spike Learns Not to Be Too Boastful episode. In fact, we've had 2 of them, specifically about the Crystal Empire. So I'm going to go ahead and add a continuity counter for that one. Actually, I'm going to add a lot of continuity counters for this episode, but we'll get to that in a minute. Anyways, so he's just kind of whatever about it, and he just shares the tale. He's pretty good with the crowd that gathers. They're the ones who make a big deal about this, not him. Meanwhile, we are introduced to Flurry Heart, who actually isn't named yet, but I'm just going to call her that for the sake of simplicity. So, she's an Alicorn. Hit the brakes. We got to talk about this. First of all, this is a definitive intentional retcon. The idea was, as of Season 3, that Celestia and Luna were both born Alicorns, and that was in the original series Bible as well by Miss Faust. So that's a definitive, no really retcon. Not necessarily a bad thing. Retcons can be good or bad. It's just something that's changed. Rarity even mentions in this episode that all Alicorns have to earn their wings, and nobody contradicts her on that, thereby passively showing that that is now the truth. This also means that at some point, Cadence had to earn her wings, and naturally, Luna and Celestia would have had to earn theirs as well. So first, the retcon itself is interesting. Can I go ahead and admit that I kind of like the retcon better than the original version? Just a little bit. Well, I've already talked much, probably too much, about my ideas of the magic and the pattern and all that fun stuff. The idea here of someone earning a magical upgrade to their being and their existence makes a lot more sense to me given everything I know about this setting, rather than someone is automatically born in such a matter. It also lines up with my own personal opinion on this matter, aka that this is all about choice and free will, not about something being enforced upon you, something I've talked about since as far back as Season 1, if you guys remember. Now, whether... Could a Pegasus or Earth Pony become an Alicorn? To my knowledge, yes. But at the same time, I don't know. So I'm going to go ahead and say, I don't know. If you're asking me my theory, I would say hypothetically, yeah. And hypothetically, if someone can earn their wings, it would be within reasonability to say that any pony could become an Alicorn under the right circumstances. Probably with likelihood being Unicorn first, Pegasi second, Earth Pony third, but all 3 being possible. Although, to my knowledge, there is no such thing as an Earth Pony who became a Pegasus, unless we count... Yup. Either way, it is an interesting thing to discuss. Because the idea there is, it's effectively the same thing as getting your cutie mark. It's just another example of that, another layer, another tier. In Forgotten Realms, which is a Dungeons & Dragons setting, for those of you not aware, you can level up in lore. Becoming more powerful, gaining experience, is actually a lore thing, not just a regular thing. Deities in Forgotten Realms also have their own forms of levels. which comes along with how much worshippers they have in their current portfolios and how much power they have over certain realms of subdivisions of the dimensions within the outer planes, right? Why is this relevant? Well, because leveling up as a person, a mortal, and leveling up as a deity is basically the same thing, but different tiers. Hence the parallel. You gain your cutie mark, you gain your Alicorn status, right? If I was writing this series, would I have every member of the main six go up to Alicorn? No. I'd have 3 of them, total. 1 of each. Hey, Lex, bro. That's what I'd do. I'd have... Applejack? I had to think about that for a second. Applejack, Twilight, and probably Fluttershy, honestly. But I'd think long and hard about that, longer than I'm doing right now. But I'd have 1 of each become an Alicorn by the show's end, as a slow progression kind of a thing. Yeah, Princess Dash. Yes, I can, S.A. Ross. What was making me hesitate there is my initial thought was no, because I would have there be 7. But there aren't 7, there's 6. So now that I'm stuck... Because then the 7th would be the Alicorn. 1 plus 6, even match the math max works out. But instead there's 6, and so it's 1 of 6, which doesn't math out. So to even that out, I'd switch it up to 3. Patterns. That's true, S.A. Ross. Fluttershy already is half of a Disney princess. She still has her parents, though. We need to kill her parents. That way she can be a Disney princess. Now, that's interesting, because Starlight would actually be a perfect fit for that, if not for the fact that Twilight is already an Alicorn. Can we get rid of her brother? Yes. Where's my stabbing knife? I'm so sorry, Mr. Red. I'm curious which ones are going to get voted on. Since, you know, obviously the vote is what actually determines what comes through. One moment, please. Why is that not working? There we go. Sorry, Laura Mum was asking me what I stream on Sundays. Can an Alicorn lose their right to the wings? Well, that's an interesting question. Because that boils down to the same question, can you lose your cutie mark? Again, if I were to equate the two, which I do equate the two, could you lose your cutie mark is the real question there. I would say no, unless... Well, okay, let me rewind that. I would say there would be no natural way to do that. For something like that to happen, it would have to be some massive external force which is altering things to the point of breaking them, right? So, in short, from a narrative perspective, that would be like a one story where Twilight loses her wings, for example, because something or someone has utterly and fundamentally altered things to the point where they are wrong, right? I'm not sure what exactly, I'm just speaking in generics, but that's probably how I'd approach that. Discord. I mean, Discord can do whatever, within reason. If the show kept going, do I think having an episode having them all grow old and the Alicorns having to say goodbye to their friends will make for a good episode? I don't know if I would do that or the opposite idea. I'd have to think about that. But yes, I think that's at least a good idea. I'm just not sure if I would do it. So hang on. While we're talking about this whole Alicorn thing, there's actually another topic, another world-building, setting topic we have to discuss. Now, this is another continuity point. In fact, this is actually probably the biggest continuity point in this episode's favor. And that would be the fact that a baby unicorn's magic is more powerful until it settles down, and a baby Pegasi's wings are more powerful until they settle down. if you remember, that was already established way back when Pinkie Pie was babysitting the Cakes babies. You remember that? They even said that in dialogue, ignoring the fact that they actually showed that on camera. So that's already established canon. So, based on that, the idea that, the moment we see an Alicorn baby, we know what we're getting into, at least if we're paying attention to continuity and are binging these. Makes sense. But I'm stuck with a question. Why? And that really just stalled me as I was staring here, like, why is it that a baby's magic is so much stronger until it settles down? Because that's the core question. I mean, we could ask why an Alicorn's magic is so powerful until it settles down, but again, it's the baby aspect of things that really matters here. So Flurry Heart being super powerful and super strong, that makes perfect sense, because she's a baby, but why is the baby thing make that a thing? Now, I was thinking in the same direction as S.A. Ross. Total lack of restraint. It's also the X-Men equation, if you guys are familiar with X-Men. For those of you who are not, because I know not all of you are familiar with it, in most of the X-Men settings, the moment you become a mutant, you have, like, no control over it. And usually there's some traumatic and bad experience that comes along with you awakening your mutant powers. Scott Summers accidentally destroying part of the school he's in. There's the story that Scott hadn't opened his eyes for 3 months because he was terrified of what happened when he did. Psychics who can suddenly hear all sorts of things around them. Just stuff like that. Similar ideas there. But I was just curious of your guys' thoughts. I was actually especially curious about Weoud, since he has that whole Winds of Magic idea that he's been postulating since, I think, Season 2 at this point. Might have been Season 1. I think Cadence couldn't blow a hole in the ceiling like that. Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure, truth be told. I know that's strange to comment on, but I suppose my point is the way it could be expressed is what they have is full adult level strength as a baby. Because, let me express this in a different thing. Do I think Rainbow Dash could carry Pinkie Pie? Yeah, absolutely. But then Flurry Heart carries Pinkie Pie without incident, just like the baby Cake was carrying her back in the babysitting episode. I can't think of the name of it, please forgive me. So, what we're effectively seeing here is adult strength, adult power, for lack of a better way to put it. I am not doing Persona 5 again, Mr. Red. Adult power in a child. But yeah, as Lord Harrimont is accurately pointing out, that would mean their relative power level was established when they were born. Which is interesting to think about. We could also have a Superman scenario here. World of Cardboard, which I will also explain for those of you not familiar with that. Superman, in most continuities, spends most of his attention and power restraining himself. If Superman actually unleashes, he can literally move planets. Literally. So, he spends the overwhelming majority of his time holding himself back. And he's learned how to do that over the years. And again, most of the continuities actually make this a plot point at some point or another. Now, I bring all this up because it's entirely possible in this setting that the adult unicorns and the adult Pegasi have learned to control and regulate and pull down all that strength and power into a smoother stream, which means they, might overall on an average level seem weaker, even though all it is they're more refined. Therefore, the baby is just going, rah! So I suppose that would make sense too. And Weoud's is quite correct. Pony's emotion can absolutely affect the magic around them, whether it's Wind's magic or otherwise. And so, the emotion would make sense there. Sweetie Belle, so... that's an interesting comment, Lord Harrimont. Admittedly, I'm not sure what I think on this one. I like the idea of the refinement thing, especially since that's arguably true in a lot of fictional settings. Sorry, I was trying to come up with a specific example. But yeah, Sweetie Belle couldn't even use magic in Season 1, and she's been on a slow progression over the seasons of getting better and better at using it. And that's actually been something I've liked as a background continuity element, and very excellent progression, too. But again, we never see Sweetie Belle as a baby. Which makes me wonder, what was Sweetie Belle like as a baby? How strong was she as a baby, you know? Now you got me thinking about this. It's also within the realm of possibility that what we have is a bit of averaging going on here. And let me use something more visible on camera. There we go. This is nice and visible. So imagine for a moment here that a new baby is born here. And so they're at this relative magic level, right? And so all this magic is just going out at this level. Then they get older and learn how to process it and refine it, and they kind of figure out how to keep it regulated. And so their relative magic level seems to be down here, but mostly this is just them refining it. And thus, it might seem like their power level's here, but their power level hasn't actually moved, right? Now, hear me out. I like the idea that this isn't an absolute, but rather an average. And thus, with time and training and skill, they can actually push it even further up and become better at whatever it is their particular magic. Because remember, most unicorns are only good at something directly related to their cutie mark. Other than that, they only have weak telekinesis. This is something that's been established ever since Season 1. So, Rarity probably couldn't do some of the things like, for example, grab an entire wardrobe and all the tools she needs to immediately start stitching until she spent the time and effort and practice to become that good at that particular expression of magic, right? If my theory is correct, and this is all theory crafting because unfortunately they just don't show us a lot of this kind of stuff on camera. So this is all just and yeah, Twilight and Starlight both have magic cutie marks, so they're up here. Food for thought. It is interesting to think about, though. And completely unrelated to Starlight. So obviously it makes the episode much better, or worse. This, of course, leads us to our next big point here. Spike being awesome, and having a brain. Sorry, I was checking something. First of all, he's finished telling the story about, his past exploits. One of the stories. There's actually another story. But he's like, look, that's cool, and we could talk about the rest of it later, but honestly, we need to keep going. 2 points about this. First of all, she tries to manipulate him again, and she fails because he's aware of it. This also implies he was aware of it to begin with. Now, that's neat in its own right, because it does help to show that, once again, Spike is currently in possession of the one brain that he and Twilight share. But in the other, he continues to still encourage her a little bit. And what I'm trying to say here is, let's say, this is a bad analogy, okay? Let's say someone's scared of swimming. Now, encouraging them in order to get back in the water again is something that a good friend thereby would do, assuming this is let's assume this is a good thing for a moment, okay? So, encouraging them would be a good thing. But it could be considered a bad thing to just shove them into the water. That's obviously case by case. Some people work better that way. But you get my point, right? So what Spike did was Spike was like, okay, we'll sit here and splash around on the edge of the lake for a little bit. But then you got to get in the water. In short, he was giving an inch, but not letting her completely walk over him. And I kind of like that more modulated approach there. Like I said, Spike is just weirdly good in this episode. He also apparently has a lot of faith in Twilight for some reason. Believe the list. Trust the list. Your whole future depends on this moment. Okay, check. I can't believe you wanted to skip that. Spike. Whatever. So, how many of you have people who you considered to be very good friends from the good old days when you were much younger, and you haven't had contact with them in years or decades? I can think of 3 from different points in my life. 2 from way back when I was in 6th, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. No, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, my bad. And then 1 from my high school years. 2 from my high school years, excuse me. Now, this doesn't really apply to me, I'll go ahead and be honest on that, because I'm an extrovert. I'm the outgoing type. I'm the one who's like, yeah, I talk to strangers, as I've mentioned several times. But I can absolutely put myself into the mindset of someone who is really nervous about meeting someone who they haven't seen in years or decades, who they used to be really good friends with. And that's the important part, the good friends part. It can't just be an acquaintance, that's just whatever. But someone who we're really close to, right? Imagine for a moment how that would feel, all that nervousness. And once again, I give the episode credit. And you'll notice one of the reasons why I'm gravitating so much towards Starlight is because of how weirdly human and really well presented she's being shown here. But she's so... It's not just nervousness. Even the way that she knocks on the door is the kind of thing someone would do if they were like completely on edge about this moment. Like, and it's just this kind of muted knock. Brilliant sound design in this whole episode, by the way, as I've already mentioned. It's like, is there anyone there? But then, and we see Stunburst for effectively the first time. Technically the third time, but first time we've actually seen Sunburst. Now, what we see here is brilliant writing, in my honest opinion. Because we have two people who are bouncing off each other awkwardly. Now you're probably thinking, what's so brilliant about that? It's the specific manner and style of which they're bouncing off each other, and why they are awkward. Because it's not the same reason. It's not just two shy people. We've seen that. It's not just two people who, don't know what they're doing. Both of them have completely separate reasons for behaving the way they do, thus leading them to naturally bounce off of each other in a way that affects the other one to make them bounce off the first person to make them... Weirdly enough, this is actually a good example of good chemistry. Now, I've talked a lot about chemistry and actors over the years, and it's always actors. Actors have chemistry, characters don't have chemistry. But the way that they present, the way the actors here present their bouncing off of each other is a good example of non-gel chemistry. Let me explain what I mean by that. Most of the time when you see good chemistry on screen, it's because two actors they just fit each other, right? They just beautifully and perfectly act off each other. Jakar and, Peter Jurassic, and I can never think of his name. Jakar's actor, back in Babylon 5. Is a perfect example of two actors who just, the moment they were on screen together, they just fit perfectly, right? That's chemistry. That's good chemistry. Harry Kim and Tom Paris over on Voyager. Gates McFadden and Patrick Stewart, over on Star Trek TNG. There are quite a few examples of this over the years. I'm not going to go down the list, but my point is, you know that when you see it. It's just, bam, they just fit. But the other type of chemistry, which you don't see nearly as often, is when two characters bounce off of each other and reflect off of each other in a way that still is good chemistry. It's just a different expression of it. And actually, Sisko and Dukat is a pretty good example of that. Mark Alemo being an excellent actor to begin with, and, oh my god, I can't think of any actors' names right now. Sisko's actor. That's gonna bug me. Avery Brooks, thank you. Avery Brooks. Both had wonderful antagonistic chemistry off of each other and managed to neatly complement each other. And the whole reason I'm bringing this up is this is what we're seeing here between the actor and the actress with regards to Stunburst and Starlight. And you could see that the dialogue was written to complement this as well. Because she has the "it was you were my world" problem, and he has the "I'm a failure" problem. Now, I want to explain that too, really quick. There's a lot in this, in just these very few scenes. It's very, very compact. A lot of depth to these scenes. So please forgive me. How many of you have ever been in a moment where you were, for whatever reason, forced out of communication with someone you cared about, and then, because of the fact that you no longer had access to them or communicated with them, they kind of got put up a little bit on a pedestal in your mind. Could be a friend, could be a family member, could be a star, a teacher, a romantic interest. Because and you could say absence makes the heart grow fonder, but what I actually mean here, because this is a slight variation on that, is by sheer virtue of the fact that you didn't actually interact with the person, all you had left was the memories of that person. And the memories kind of got polished down until all you were thinking about them is in a positive light, until you got to the point where you were thinking of them more positively than I should. And eventually you were no longer looking at them, you're looking at the ideal of them, not them. Now this is something I've personally experienced, I'll go ahead and admit to that. But this is something that crops up a lot in fiction. I even talked about this during StarCraft, to bring that into this one. So you're left with James Raynor and Sarah Kerrigan, for those of you wondering. Mr. Raynor was left with the ideal version of Kerrigan in his mind, because Kerrigan, for all intents and purposes, died after the event, during the events of StarCraft 1. And that negatively affected him and his personality, and kind of led to these huge problems when he finally got to interact with the real Kerrigan again for the first time in years. Now, I don't want to go too much into that, it's a whole other lore pit, but you get the idea. That's where Starlight is. Now, she doesn't say this outright, but she doesn't have to. Her entire arc and character motivation has been entirely focused on the fact that she had this one friend that she lost. I never want to feel that way again, right? I never want to lose that again. But by virtue of how she reacts and how she shows, what she doesn't say is how much Sunburst meant to her, or perhaps more accurately, how up in her mentality the ideal of Sunburst was for her. So she had built up Sunburst to be this big, important, critical moment, a critical friend, her one and only friend. And now she's interacting with him. And she shows that in the awkwardness and the uncertainty, and how she's not even willing to fully be honest with him about what's going on and why. And yeah, I agree. In Chrono Trigger, Magus's idealization of Shala absolutely falls into that same category. No question. After all, as I'll talk about during the Chrono Trigger Totally Not a Lore run, after a while there, he wasn't even interested in her as his sister, because he threw that opportunity away in pursuit of simple vengeance. Probably in part because he actually met his sister again, and it wasn't what he was expecting. But again, we'll talk about that when we get to Chrono Trigger. Meanwhile, there's his side of things. So... oh yeah, Spike is just back there going... Again, I have some credit for Spike on this episode, but meanwhile, Sunburst, well, he has something that I'm sure a lot of us can relate to. He feels like a failure. I feel that every day of my life. But I do stress the words feel like. I'm not calling anyone a failure, because honestly that's a far harder thing to judge. But you know what I mean, right? By now I should have been such and such. At this point in my life I could have been doing whatcha-fig. I was supposed to be this big Hazifong. I don't know what a Hazifong is, but by God, you were going to be a big one. You know what that feels like, right? I'm sure most people ever feel that way. Kings feel that way. One of the biggest written down, stated historical intents behind several historical wars that happened in real life history was because a king felt that they weren't owing up to what they should be, their dynasty, their lineage. They needed to make their mark on history, right? And I point that out because that just goes to show how that's just not a thing for normal people like us. But everyone feels that to some extent or another. And yeah, as S.A. Ross points out, for every graduate there is a burnout, and that is basically, not a burnout, a dropout, and that is basically Sunburst. Now, so that's his shtick. Now, this is how they bounce off of each other so beautifully, because she was expecting someone who was like, ha, and instead she gets this weird kind of awkward guy who's just sort of nonplussed, like, wait, Starlight? Is that you? And she's just not a big deal to him, and she can tell. Meanwhile, she casually talks about being the personal apprentice to the Princess of Friendship. And you notice how Sunburst immediately goes, what? Like, his eyes go wide, and there's just this moment of, huh? When he hears that. So that random friend he barely remembers from a decade or two ago is some huge named person who's just got all... And we know how Princess happy the society is, right? And so he's just... And so those two awkwardnesses, those two unique and distinct awkwardnesses just go boing right off of each other. And I love it. Forgive me for gushing so much. Like I said, there's a lot of density to these scenes. But there's so much. This is why I like this episode so much, by the way. Is because of these little moments like this. We've just covered like 30 seconds of screen time. And honestly, I have no doubt that Twilight and Sunburst actually went to school together. At least a little bit. You know, same general age range. And I wrote this in my notes, and I want to repeat this out loud here. She's hesitant, he's embarrassed, and I love how exceptionally how an exceptionally relatable human interaction is happening between two magical unicorns. Meanwhile, Rainbow is choosing the guard, Rarity is picking up the gems, and Armor is stressed. Nothing really to add there. But, in a show for kids. Another nice little tidbit, though. I think this might be the first time, or the second time, I'm not sure, we've seen the closest thing to an honest-to-goodness counterspell in this show. I'm not actually 100% sure on that, because it's possible Twilight was using counterspell on Starlight in just the last episode. But she actually is counterspelling the spells that Flurry Heart is throwing around as she's roaming around. Just little tiny food for thought, because the whole point of a counterspell is, in most settings, in most lore, is that you either disconnect the spell from the magic, which is probably not what's happening here, or, far more likely, you counteract it directly, right? Borg. The Borg do this. This is how Borg shielding works. They throw up energy, which is designed to take and displace and effectively absorb the energy of the shot that's happening. So, for all intents and purposes, nothing happens. You know, you shoot 15x, we shoot 15x, right? That's the idea. I'm massively oversimplifying this, but you get the idea. Apparently she used counterspell in bats. Okay, so we're up to 2 times that she's used counterspell. I just wanted to comment on that really quick. Meanwhile, Sunburst. I don't understand. Did anything happen after I left for magic school? Naturally, she freaks out. Starts pouring the tea, and pouring the tea, and pouring the tea. But interestingly enough, the other thing she does, and once again, villainous, is she goes on the offensive. Why? Did anything happen to you after we left magic school? And again, the actress sells this, because it's clear that she is deliberately trying to provoke something. She's trying to push something here and be like, shove. And go right back on, push the topic right back onto him. And naturally, because he has his own embarrassment things, he's just like, oh no, I'm a big important wizard. She's a brilliant voice actress. I think, not for the first time, I think a lot of why I like Starlight Glimmer as a character is because of the voice acting involved. Anyways, this then leads to Flurry Heart destroying the Crystal Heart. This is an artifact. Now, one of the things we established back when the Crystal Heart was first announced and showcased on this show was that it's a channeler. And we talked about that, and I actually showed my evidence. We had a huge discussion about it, if you remember. What it is it channels emotion, thought, magic, etc. Thus, it served as an amplifier, actually, would probably be a better word. But you remember that discussion, or at least I hope you do. This then makes this make a weirdly amount of sense. I was going to go on this big discussion of why the heart would be destroyed, but then I realized that we have a very powerful, a very powerful Alicorn, which is just gone through emotionally traumatizing thing by virtue of being a baby. And she happens to be right next to the heart, so the heart naturally channels that, and... So no, actually that makes a weirdly large amount of sense to me, so I withdraw my complaints. I will say this, though. I have to admit, yeah. Well, okay, let's talk about that really quick. Why is that a hugely emotionally traumatizing thing? One of the things that people need to understand about babies is that they lack understanding. And so everything tends to be pretty binary. There's good, and then there's bad. Anything good is the best thing ever, and anything bad is the worst thing ever, because they don't have the experience, knowledge, understanding, or perspective to scale that out. They don't have a list, a gradient, or a measuring stick. All they have is good and bad. Oh yeah, they also have no object permanence, which is related to this. So something that is bad to a child or a baby, more specifically, because children start to learn this pretty quickly. But something that is bad, relatively speaking, is the worst. So imagine something really horrifically traumatizing to you, or don't, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, and then channel that emotion with all the magical power of being an Alicorn, and it thus makes perfect sense that the crystal heart would shatter. In fact, frankly, I would call this inevitable. And then, of course, the episode decides to be hilarious. Oh my god! We're all gonna die! To be continued! I have to admit, you got me there. Now. Yeah, Cadence is just... And Flurry Heart's just like... So I'm going to hold off on rating this episode, as I often do when it comes to two-parters, because we still need to go through part 2. So, I'm going to go and chop off, and we'll be back. This time I don't have to upload the Lore Week video, so we'll be back in about 23 or 24 minutes for part 2.